and welcome to the Hybrid School Builders Podcast. I am your host, Rebecca Foley, and I am so glad you are joining me today. I am a fellow grassroots founder who is hoping to make your journey toward founding a sustainable hybrid school a little bit easier. If you are dreaming of starting a hybrid school, or perhaps you've already gotten started, you are in the right place. Join me as we dive into real stories, practical tips, and hard-won lessons that I have learned to help you launch and grow your program with confidence. Remember, building a hybrid school is not just about creating a business or creating jobs. It's not even about just serving the children who attend the program. It's literally about reshaping the landscape of education, and we can do that one community, one entrepreneur, and one program at a time. Okay, guys, so we did several episodes on nonprofit leadership and governance and boards and all of that. So let's talk a little bit about some operational details when you're first getting started with your business. So if you sent your paperwork in and now you're getting into taking in students and hiring, you're looking forward into that. In between those two things, you want to make sure that your money flow and your bookkeeping are set up right. Okay. Now, really, this is one of those like prep things where if you put in a little bit of time in the beginning to make sure that it's set up correctly, and then you just stay on top of it, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and frustration later on. Okay. So the first step in that is to make sure that you have a business bank account. Keep all the funds separate from your personal money. Okay. Set up a business bank account. You can check if you are a nonprofit, you can check around for promotional things that give better minimums and fees and all of that. But a small business bank account usually just does the job. If you have to keep a certain minimum in there so you don't have fees, we want to check on the details like that. Something to think about if there's more than one of you is to possibly only put one name on the account as the owner. That's just something you want to just think about. It's not necessarily like a better way to do it. In fact, if you're a nonprofit, it might be better to have two people. But the thing with the owner of the account is that it can be difficult to do other things later without both or three or however many people are the owners actually being there. So like if you want to add someone as a signer, the owner can do that. But if there's more than one owner, both the owners have to be there, right? There's certain things you have to do where you'd have to have both people if they're owners involved, and it can just be a little clunkier. Where if you just have one owner of the account, they can add signers, take off signers, open things, close things, and they can just do that as the owner. It just can be a little more streamlined. If you're a nonprofit, this is also part of where you want to be thinking through those financial transparency things. And if you just start from the beginning by having your treasurer and the bookkeeper, whoever, being able to have access to certain parts of the account as far as like the statements, maybe having the statements mailed to the treasurer, that kind of like transparency stuff. If you can just get that set up from the beginning that way, so there's multiple eyes on the account, that can just have everything get started in the right direction. If you're an LLC, you still want to have a business bank account for sure, but you don't have to worry about all the transparency stuff. Okay. So keep your funds separate, open a business bank account. And then what you want to do is connect that account to some sort of bookkeeping software. That's generally how it's done now, I think, is some sort of like online connection where the transactions get fed into the bookkeeping software. Okay, Wave Apps is one. I use that for years. A lot of people still use that if your transactions are fairly simple. They have a free version that does a pretty decent job. There are some bank accounts where you can actually do some bookkeeping inside of the account, but I wouldn't necessarily count on that unless it's really built specifically for what you're doing. You probably need to connect some sort of outside software. QuickBooks is the like go-to for accountants and bookkeepers. It can be a bit robust and expensive when you're first getting started and you're small. So a lot of times I recommend just using Wave Apps, but you're connecting the bank account so that all of the money that goes in and out of the account, tuition payments, fees, donations, whatever, goes into that bank account, and then it shows up on that bookkeeping software. And then somebody needs to label it. And this is where the bookkeeping part comes in. I could go on about this, but the important thing is that those transactions are getting labeled. They're getting named. If you let it slide, which is very easy to do this because it's not the most fun thing to do. So set it, if you let it slide, it can just get where you go in and you've got 10 or 20 or 50 transactions, and now you can't remember what they are, especially if it's like check number 4 and you're like, oh, I thought I'd remember what that check was. I might be exposing myself here for how sometimes I think I'm going to remember things and I don't always write things down and do them right away. But if you're like me, don't trust your memory necessarily. But again, when you're small, you might not have very many transactions, and it might be easy to just go in like once a week and just label it. So you're going in and you're categorizing those transactions. And I would say, and this is not proper bookkeeping advice, what a trained bookkeeper would necessarily do. There's proper language and everything for that. And if you plan on hiring a proper bookkeeper, which I would recommend at some point, especially as you're growing. So what I'm about to tell you isn't necessarily professional accounting bookkeeping advice, right? But to get you through those first few months, if you're just getting everything off the ground on your own, just use language that makes sense to you so that you can explain it to the accountant or the bookkeeper later. And things aren't either getting automatically labeled through whatever software. Sometimes it'll just automatically do stuff and you go in and you're like, but that's not what that was. Like, I don't know, this report is completely wrong. And it was just like automatically labeling things. So you can keep it really simple. You can just have like supplies, and it's everything from pencils to books, okay? And you just label it as supplies, right? And you want to have like your major categories, taxes, insurances, right? So you might have 10 or 12 different categories, and you want to be able to interpret it yourself. Ultimately, why this matters is for tax season. So when you sit down with an accountant at some point, which is going to happen, whether you're an LLC or a nonprofit, you're going to have to send all this over to an accountant. They need to be able to tell what was happening with the money, okay? That's why we bother doing any of this, besides just being sustainable and making sure we actually have money and we know where it's going, which is basic kind of budgeting, making sure that you know where the money is coming from and if there's enough to cover all your costs and, where it's all going. Budgeting even on a personal basis, sometimes if you're not labeling stuff or you're not aware of where your money is going, you're just like, wow, I feel like I spent a lot of money this month and I don't really know where it went. And, that's an easy thing to do. It can just happen because you didn't make note of where it was actually going, and it just kind of adds up and goes away and you're not really sure where it went. So it's a combination of stewardship of the funds, budgeting the plan, and then also tracking to see if it's going and if it's going where it's supposed to be going, if it's matching up with the budget, so you can adjust for the next time period, whether that's every quarter or every year, so that you're adjusting and you can make sure you're sustainable. So those are like your two main reasons, right? Is your sustainability, your budgeting, make sure that you've got the money where it's all going. And also just to make sure that you sit down with the accountant, you send the paperwork over and they can interpret it and it makes sense, okay? In my experience, if I could explain to the accountant what I had labeled, because most of the transactions were fairly simple, especially for the first several years. Like we had tuition, we had some fees. That was basically where the money was coming from. And then it was going out in just half a dozen or so categories. And it wasn't many transactions a day. It was just purchases, salaries, rent, checks being written. And it was fairly simple. Okay, it got more complex if you have different, like a credit card or multiple people using a credit card or Amazon Business setup or that kind of thing gets a lot more complex. And that can be very useful later on. And you have to think about your bookkeeping as you're setting those things up. But when you're first getting started, you just want to label things, okay? So you just get some basic categories that make sense to you and just make sure every transaction is getting labeled in that software. If you just connect your bank account to Wave apps, you can just get started with that. I believe they also do invoicing. So if you're kind of just getting started and you want to invoice tuition manually through Wave apps, set up your people in there and then send them an invoice to pay their tuition. Like you can do all of that in there and then you just label it. So if you're a nonprofit, the other thing is you do need to be careful about labeling any kind of donations that you get, whether it's people donating items, whether it's like grants, especially if they're like restricted grants where you have to spend them on something in particular. Don't just personal donations as people just give you money. You do have to make sure that you label those clearly. And again, I am not a professional bookkeeper, but I found that you're going to be a lot safer in the long run if you be a little more specific with things so you can interpret it. So if you're spending out a particular grant you got, name that deposit from the grant, name it the grant. You need to be able to interpret it to your accountant. What you don't want to do is sit down with the accountant or have them send back a spreadsheet and say, hey, label all these transactions for us so that we know what it was. And you look at it and you're like, I don't know. That was 6 months ago. I don't know what it was, right? That's like a very stressful place to be in. So you just want to say, like, this was the name of the grant and this was the deposit. That's what it was. And with a restricted grant, you have to spend it on a particular things, right? Like if you get a science grant and it has to be spent on science equipment, then whenever you're spending that grant out, I would just say, I would use the same name of the grant and just say it was an expense. And that way I could run a report. The reports are just useful for your accountant, for your board if you're a nonprofit, and also just for you, wherever you are, to know where the money is going. And you can just take a time period and say, okay, how much money did we spend on supplies? How much money did we spend on insurance? How much money did we spend on rent? And if you've labeled everything, it just spits it out for you, and now you know, okay? So set up your bank account, connect it to a bookkeeping software, and just make sure that you label those transactions in a way that makes sense. If you're hiring a bookkeeper from day one, they will take care of this for you, but you still have to tell them what the transactions were or give them some guideline, like everything that was purchased from, this business was curriculum and every check that was written to this was rent or whatever. So you can certainly do that with a bookkeeper, and that definitely eases things. But if you're buying a lot of, like, you stopped at Staples or you bought stuff on Amazon and you have all these little transactions, the bookkeeper doesn't know what they are, you're still going to have to tell them. So in my experience, if I was the one doing most of the purchasing, or there was one or two people doing most of the purchasing, it was easier to just label it myself as it came in and then have a bookkeeper check in on it every so often. That was easier in the beginning until you have somebody who really knows and can use the proper bookkeeping language that can then be read by the accountant, okay? Ideally, you have a bookkeeper who's a professional from day one, and you just sit down with them, make sure you're speaking the same language, make sure you understand what they're labeling things and what you're labeling things are the same words, okay? Because it also doesn't do you much good if they label everything properly for the accountant, but then when they give you the report, you don't know what it is saying, okay? So make sure that you understand that, and sometimes you have to ask that. You have to say, I need to know, like, how you're labeling things, and here's how I'm labeling things, and can we make sure we're speaking the same language? Okay. A chart of accounts is what that is called, like what those categories are called, so you can say that to your bookkeeper. And then once a year, you have to send that over to an accountant to have all of the taxes actually filed, okay? So hire a professional if you can, but if you can't, just make sure you're labeling things. That's what a chart of accounts is. It's categories. And if you're a nonprofit, make sure that you're labeling your donations clearly, grants clearly, as well as all of those other things. And the other thing I don't want to forget to say, if you're a nonprofit, is the program expenses and the administrative expenses are kind of a big deal. So things that are spent for, like, kind of back office infrastructure sorts of things, payroll system fees, that kind of thing is administrative. And this matters in nonprofit. It doesn't matter as much in an LLC, but in nonprofit it does. And then program stuff is the stuff that's actually spent on the kids. And in my experience, again, there's some gray areas where you're kind of like, I don't know. I mean, I'm only hiring this program logistical person because of the programs that we have. They're probably a program expense, but maybe they're also doing some administrative stuff. You can also divide it up and put like 50 or 80% of a salary or rent for program and 50 or 20% of the salary to administrative. I wouldn't overthink it, and I'm not giving you professional nonprofit accounting advice. You really want to sit down and talk to someone who's a professional about this if you're going to do it yourself. But just be aware of that. Be aware that administrative and program distinctions matter in a nonprofit, and be aware that donations and grants also matter a lot in how you're labeling things. Otherwise, it's just knowing where the money is going, okay? Set that up from the beginning correctly, and you'll be glad later on. Wave Apps is a good tool, but you can also sign up for some other bookkeeping software if you would like to. If you have your 501c3 status, you can go to TechSoup, and I believe you can most of the time get QuickBooks a lot more cheaply than the normal price is for it. But I think you have to have your letter from the IRS already when you do that. You can't just have your incorporation with the state. So TechSoup has some good deals on things like that for nonprofits. One other thing for a nonprofit is the way that the money is coming in. It can get very scrambled if your money that's being collected for any kind of fundraising event is going through a platform that's also being used for something that's like program operational. Okay, so let's say that you're collecting fees for a field trip and people pay for the field trip, and then you write a check to the field trip place, and that's coming through like Sign Up Genius or something. Okay. When you go into Sign Up Genius and you see the money that came through Sign Up Genius and then back out again, that is not fundraising, right? That's just people are paying for their ticket through you for this field trip. Okay. But if you're also using Sign Up Genius for, an after school fundraising class or a lunch program that's supposed to be for fundraising, right? Like maybe you charge $5 for submarine sandwiches, whatever you call them in your part of the country, and they actually only cost you $3. So it's like a fundraising lunch, right? If that's also coming through the same platform, distinction between nonprofit fundraising things and just basic operational expenses, because that's important in your bookkeeping, you want to probably use a different platform for the fundraising events if you can, just because when it shows up in your bank account and you see like Sign Up Genius dumped money into your bank account for this field trip or this event, all you see on the dump is that it's from Sign Up Genius, right? And if it's all like scrambled together, it is a bear to try to untangle what was which, okay? So you want to think about that. It can be a lot easier to just do all of your fundraising nonprofit stuff through one type of sign up, and then do your like operational signups through something else. If you're using something like our school Hangout, I haven't used this, but if you're using something like that where you have different signups, just make sure that it's giving you a report per event, okay? So that you can go in and say how much money came in for the lunches that was a fundraising event. And then you can take that chunk of money and say this was fundraising in your bookkeeping. And then if it was a field trip, it was a different sign up. You can generate that report and say how much money came in for this event. And you can label that, even though it might end up going into your bank account from the same platform. So I'm just warning you, because this was something that was difficult to untangle afterward, just because of the way the money comes through the platforms and gets dumped back into your account. And then you don't know what event it was for. And it wouldn't matter, except if it's a nonprofit fundraising sort of thing versus an operational thing. So the principle to live by with bookkeeping and money management is to keep things separate from your personal, make sure things are categorized, make sure that nonprofit distinctive things like donations and fundraising are clearly labeled and easy to read in the money flow, the way that it's getting from whoever to the bookkeeper. It's easy to read as much as possible. So think about how the money is flowing. If you just get those things set up, you're going to be in a lot better shape going forward, and you just stay on top of it, and you'll be glad later on. If you're a nonprofit, also try to set up those second set of eyes transparency practices also from the beginning, and that also just saves you a lot of time having to go back and figure out how to make it work later on. Thanks so much for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe and make sure you check out the resources I am developing at startahybridSchool.com. Send me an email anytime. I would love to hear from you. Until next time.